All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the beginning of the third week together. So we're starting to get deep into this process. We're not ridiculously deep yet, but certainly things are moving forward, not just in this class, but your other classes. I hope by now you've come to terms with the fact that you are in full-fledged school right now and things are happening, that you should be on top of things. You should be learning things. You should be devoting as much time as possible to this whole thing. And any time you have left over is what you use to, take your mind off stuff, deal with personal business, etc. But this is what you do. And every moment you have is an opportunity to get ahead, to make this whole thing more comfortable for yourselves so you don't wind up in crappy situations around time of midterms, which is right around the corner. And things start to pile up. You don't have enough time to take care of things the right way. You wind up not doing that great. You feel bad about it, etc., etc., etc. If you start building yourself up now, that whole process won't build you down if you let it get out of your control. So stay focused, stay in the moment, and make sure that everything is taken care of. Are there any questions you want me to address about anything before I move forward with the lecture? Yeah. The middle of next week. Yeah. We'll finish another chapter on Thursday, so there'll be another one. So don't let things pile up. Get things done. Of course, I do drop 3 homework assignments in case things get in the way in life that stop you because of emergencies or whatnot from doing assignments. But don't use that as an excuse to not do the assignments. Do them. They're going to help you learn the material, which is ultimately what's important. So make sure you get those things done. And as I mentioned on Moodle and in answer to somebody on Piazza, like the homework, most assignments will have a couple of graphing problems at the end. And the graphing section's a little glitchy. Sometimes it's not going to work that great on a browser, but it'll work great on another browser, so you have to try that. If you're having technical difficulties you can't overcome, contact Launchpad directly, as I've stated. There's a Launchpad number that is on Moodle, that is on Launchpad, etc. But ultimately, what may happen is you may wind up losing some points here and there on the homework because of these things, and it's nothing for you to be concerned about. I don't care about a couple of points on the homework, and neither should you. The homework is about learning. Learn the material. Where your grade will be determined in this class will be on exams. So if you're not learning the material and doing well in the exams, you're not going to do well in the class. Splitting hairs about 1 or 2 points on each homework assignment is going to have zero effect. It's just going to take time out of your day, my day, and it's unnecessary. So don't worry about missing a couple points here and there on the homework assignment. If I cared about that, then I wouldn't give you the solutions to the homework. Like, I want you to use it as a tool to learn. The book, the lectures, the homework, it's all meant to help you learn, including the practice exam that's online. It's all meant to help you prepare, for doing well in the class, for helping you achieve comprehension of the concepts we're covering, etc. So use it as such. Don't freak out about a couple of points here and there on the homework. It's not going to have any kind of effect. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I'll do that. Other stuff? All right, then let us jump into what we're going to cover today. I'm going to take a couple of steps back and do some practice problems from some stuff we covered in the last 2 chapters. So we are 3 chapters in. So the first chapter just covered the basic principles that underlie the basic approach that economics takes. And then we jumped into the second chapter that highlighted the nature of the most important tool that defines our approach, which is the model, the simplification of reality. And we had a very specific model in that chapter that was called the production possibility frontier. It allowed us to examine sort of the nature of what an economy can produce. And then we used it to identify a comparative advantage that one country may have versus another, or one party may have versus another. And that ultimately came down to whoever has the lowest opportunity cost has the comparative advantage in producing something. So the mechanics of that model provided us information, but also gave us insights into just the nature of what we do and what kind of insights our simplifications can get us to. Ultimately, the model got us to that point where it became clear that there are gains from trade. If one specializes in what one is best at and lets others do things that they're best at, and then you trade, then everybody can have more of everything. So we'll cover a multiple choice question, just kind of highlighting a couple of issues revolving around the PP, the production possibility frontier. It's actually the PPF, not PPP, sorry. We have a PPP, something else in economics. That's why I got it mixed up. Anyway, and then we'll jump into a practice short answer where I'll cover some things that may happen in the stake market. So in chapter 3, we learned about the workhorse model for this class, and for economics in general, the market model, the competitive market model, where there's supply, there's demand, they meet in the middle. There's an equilibrium price, an equilibrium quantity that is established in markets as a result. And then something can change in the market. Either supply will shift either direction, demand will shift either direction, and we talked about the things that could shift those, and that will change the equilibrium for the market. So you can use the model to just kind of examine how a change in either supply or demand will affect the price in that market, how much is being produced in that market, how much is being consumed in that market. And we talked about the last case where, depending on how much the curves shift, if both of them are shifting at the same time, the results won't be clear. And maybe it'll be clear with respect to quantity, the equilibrium quantity that's being transacted in the market, but not the price. The price, it might not be clear whether it goes up or down, or it might be the other case where it's clear what's happening with price, but it's not clear what's happening with quantity. And so the model can help you just provide that insight. If the insight is we don't know what happens with price, and that's a substantial insight. That's something that says, well, it just depends on the forces of the market, how much each side is shifting, and that is enough to say to have an understanding about how something might affect the market. You don't necessarily have to know exactly how it will affect it, as long as you can say, well, we don't know because of this, right? Anyway, so models, super powerful, the tool that we use in economics. So I'll just, again, jump into a question that specifically focuses on the market model. In this case, the market that we're looking at is the stake market. And then there's actually a couple more that we'll jump into it. And I didn't put them in the agenda, but I'm doing it just to kind of get you thinking about how you're going to be tested. There's going to be multiple choice questions. There's going to be short answer questions. They may or may not be the ones I present in class. Occasionally, I will present questions like this throughout the lecture, maybe after I'm done with the chapter or whatever. I kind of sprinkle them throughout. But they're not the end-all, be-all of questions that you could see. Again, it's about learning the concepts, learning the models, and then if you have that understanding, you should be able to maneuver yourself through whatever an exam throws at you. So that focus should be on learning everything. But, the practice stuff is just, again, meant to kind of get your feet wet with respect to how you might be expected to think about certain concepts. Again, there's a practice exam online for the first exam. You can check that out. You should check it out early just to kind of see what it's going to be like and maybe start getting some insights from those. But another good thing to do is to not look at the answer key and then right before the exam, kind of take the exam, the practice exam, and then time yourself in the same way you would be timed in class, and then grade yourself, see how you do, and then that could be sort of your starting point of like, okay, I get this stuff, I need to learn some other things, and that's one strategy for practice, for preparing for exams that you could use the practice exam online for. You could use that any way you want. Again, everything I offer you is meant to just be available to you and provide you flexibility in whatever approach you choose to take in learning the material you need to learn in this class. But keep in mind that the tools are there and that you shouldn't ignore them. Like, they're there. Use them. Use them to your advantage. And then, so once we're done kind of going through these couple of problems, we will jump into Chapter 4. We won't finish Chapter 4 today, but we'll just get it started. And Chapter 4 highlights a couple of concepts that we can extract from the market model, and that is the idea of consumer and producer surplus. So if a market is working as best it possibly can, and the best possible type of market is a competitive market, which we've been looking at in the last chapter, then the benefit to consumers and producers will be the best possible, the most possible. And how we measure that benefit, how we define that benefit, is in consumer and producer surplus. So you have a bunch of buyers, a bunch of sellers, they interact in the market. The buyers, not all of them are willing to pay the price that the market has set. Some of them are not willing to pay that price at all. They value the good less, and so they won't even buy in the market. But there's people that value the good more than the market charges. And so each individual person has a consumer surplus with respect to the good that they're buying. So if the price is $3 and somebody values something at $5, there's a consumer surplus for that person for $2. And then so you can get that information for the entire market using the model that we introduced in the last chapter. And that information is powerful in business. It can be used for a variety of reasons, which I'll lightly touch upon later in the course. But all these concepts are kind of building blocks for ultimately being able to analyze markets in the best way possible. But in order to get to that point where you're able to do that, you need to, build up the components and be very specific about, on my part, presenting it, and on your part, like, comprehending it. So we'll slowly build up the concept of consumer and then producer surplus. Producers have a surplus as well. Producers have a certain cost they need met in order to supply in a market. If the price is above their cost, then they will have a producer surplus. If it only costs them $3 to produce something and they get to charge $5, the difference between those two is the producer surplus. So we'll look at both sides of the market, and we'll do some computations to be able to get an idea of how much of each of these surpluses exists in a particular market. So we'll talk about consumer surplus and the demand curve, and then producer surplus and the supply curve. All right, but first let's talk about the production possibility frontier. So all points inside the production possibility frontier represent A, efficient production points, B, inefficient production points, C, infeasible production points, or D, economic growth. So we're talking about points inside the production possibility frontier. Raise your hand if you think the answer is A. Raise your hand if you think the answer is B. Gesundheit. Raise your hand if you think the answer is C. And raise your hand if you think the answer is D. All right. People have been learning, apparently. Yes, you are correct. B is the answer. So let's look at the concept again. So an economy is efficient if it takes all opportunities to make some people better off without making other people worse off. So it's using all of its resources to the best capacity possible. It's not letting things just kind of sit around. And the concept is in contrast to equity. Equity is fairness. So when we're talking about efficiency in economics, we're talking about something very specific. Are markets doing the best they can given the nature of markets? Is that good or bad for society? Is that good or bad for the people in the market? That's an issue of equity, which has to do with fairness, which is left up to like the political realm to sort of figure out. Like, we are not economists. The economics profession is not about deciding is this good or bad. It's just about like analyzing, doing what's called positive analysis, where we just kind of see exactly what's happening and describe it as such, versus doing normative analysis, where we give our opinion about what the situation might be. So whether it's good or bad, or how it should go versus like how it might go based on the information we have. So as far as the production possibility frontier, again, the production possibility frontier, here it's just a straight line, but we know that it can have something other than a straight line. It can have a curved line. So again, it represents, the production possibility frontier is a representation of a simplified economy in which only two goods are being produced. In this case, it's small jets and large jets, which they call dreamliners. The line represents combinations of the two goods being produced that use all of the resources to produce. Nothing is being left, like there aren't people that aren't working, there aren't machines and buildings that aren't being used to produce. So we say that they are efficient in production. If they are inside the production possibility frontier, they are combinations of the two goods that can be produced. We say they are feasible. But they are not efficient in production because, like let's say at point C, you're producing 20 small jets and 9 dreamliners. Well, you could be using more of your resources to produce, on top of those 20 jets, actually 6 more dreamliners, so up to 15. Or you can just leave the dreamliners at 9 and produce 28 small jets. So the points inside the production possibility frontier are not efficient in production, and that's what the question was referring to. And then points outside the production possibility frontier represent points that are not feasible, that you just don't have the resources to produce. And then another thing to note about the one we just looked at with respect to the straight line is that the opportunity cost of producing more of one good is constant along it. So as you're producing more jets, you're giving up the same amount of dreamliners, whether you're at point A and you're going to point B, or you're going from point B all the way here where you are just producing small jets, versus a curved a production possibility frontier that represents a situation in which the opportunity cost is increasing as you produce more of one good versus another. So in this case, as you produce the first 20 small jets, you're giving up only 5 dreamliners, whereas when you try to increase the production of small jets again by 40 and use all your resources just to produce small jets, you actually have to give up 25 dreamliners for that second 20 small jets that you want to produce. And that reflects the fact that we're adding a little bit more complexity into our simple model by saying, well, if you're using more of resources to produce something, that means that those resources aren't going to be as good at producing something as the earlier resources that were maybe dedicated specifically to it. So you might have some people and some machines that are specifically meant to create small jets, but as you increase the quantity of small jets you produce and decrease the quantity of dreamliners you produce, the bigger jets, then you have to retrain these people to produce the small jets, so they're not going to produce as fast. You're also going to need to repurpose technology that wasn't meant to produce small jets versus large jets. So it's just an example of how like you can make your model a little bit more complicated by adding a little bit more detail into it. So there's degrees of complexity that can be introduced to models. But again, these are just characteristics of this specific, very simple, very precise model that we covered in Chapter 2 that I thought we'd review slightly here. All right, demand and supply shifts. So we talked about that last time where you have a demand curve, you have a supply curve. They set up an equilibrium price and quantity for the market. And if a curve shifts, you need to be able to tell me what happens as a result of that curve shifting. What happens on both sides of the market. So let's look at an example. So this is not necessarily exactly what you would see on an exam, or it is. Who knows? There could be different versions of it. I could ask you to graph any of the graphs that I've presented in class are fair game to be graphed in an exam. So I can ask you to graph anything, or I can just ask you to explain to me the effects of something, which might entail you graphing it for yourself just so you can figure it out and then kind of getting to the result. So let's say I say, explain and graph the effect of the following developments on equilibrium, price, and quantity in the market for steak. So the first one is the price of chicken, a substitute for steak, falls. So let's say the price of chicken, a substitute for steak, falls. What's going to happen in the steak market? Is that going to affect the supply side or the demand side of the steak market? The demand side, right? Because they're substitutes, right? So as the price of chicken goes down, people are going to demand less steak at any given price. So here is the market for steak in equilibrium before a change, right? Here's a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Price is on the Y vertical axis. Quantity is on the X horizontal axis. The two curves intersect at this point, which represents the equilibrium for the market. So you've got an equilibrium price where everybody's willing to buy and sell steak for, and this is the amount that's being transacted in the market. We talked about last time what could happen if the market is not in equilibrium and why it would drive the market to equilibrium. If the price, let's say, was down here, then what you would do is you would look at the supply curve at that price and see, oh, the quantity supplied is this much, and then you would jump to the demand curve at that price and say, oh, the quantity demanded at that price is a lot bigger. It's this amount, which is much larger than this amount, right? This is the x-axis. We're moving from 0 to a larger quantity as we move from left to right. So therefore, if the price is below equilibrium, so what we say is that we have a shortage in the market, right? Like there's a lot more demand than there is being supplied. When that happens, these people over here that value the good more than the price they're paying for it will start bidding up the price. As they do that, the suppliers up here that have costs that aren't being met by this low price will start to sell as the price goes up. And so suppliers will supply more, and eventually it'll get us to that point of equilibrium. If the price is above the equilibrium, then quantity supply will exceed quantity demanded. And so you'll have a bunch of sellers that have a bunch of stuff on the shelves and nobody's buying. So you'll have a surplus of goods in that case. So when that happens, when there's only so many people looking to buy and a lot more being sold, suppliers will start lowering their prices. As they start lowering their prices, people that weren't willing to pay a higher price will start willing to buy because now what they value the good at is being met. So then they will start to buy. That will lead us to this point of equilibrium. So regardless of whether you start above an equilibrium in a competitive market or below the equilibrium in the competitive market, what we call the market forces will drive the market to equilibrium, either from the top or the bottom. So here is our steak market. That's our equilibrium. That's why it is in equilibrium. Now the price of chicken, a substitute for steak, falls. You told me that it will affect the demand side. So how do we describe that? What's going to happen to demand in this market? Demand will decrease, right? So remember, there's a difference between a movement along a curve and a shift of the curve. So in this case, because demand is shifting at any given price, people are going to buy less steak because now chicken is cheaper, so they're substituting away from steak to chicken. Then the demand curve will shift to the left. So that is what will happen. The demand curve shifts to the left. And so at that old equilibrium price now we're at a point where this is our new demand curve. So now supply outweighs demand. So again, you're going to have more steak being produced and being bought. So suppliers are going to lower their price. People are going to start buying again because the price is going down. And it'll get us to that new equilibrium. So what's going to happen to equilibrium price in this market? Right. And what's going to happen to equilibrium quantity in this market? In this market for steak. It'll decrease, right? Exactly. So that's what happened on the demand side. What happened on the supply side? How do we describe that? Right. Remember, there was a distinction between a shift versus a movement along. So how do we describe that? A decrease in, not a decrease in supply. That's a shift of the curve. Somebody was saying it. A decrease in A decrease in quantity. We're talking about the other side of the market. A decrease in quantity supplied. Yes, that is what I was looking for. You've got to be able to describe what's happening in the very precise terms. The price of chicken has gone down. Demand in the market for steak has decreased, which shifted the curve. That's how we describe that. A decrease in demand. Because there was a decrease in demand, then quantity supplied decreased. There was a movement along the supply curve. The supply curve itself did not shift, but quantity supply decreased because, again, at the old equilibrium, the price was too high, too much was on the shelves, and so demand wasn't enough. There was a surplus, so that brought us to this point. Suppliers started to lower the price. There was a decrease in quantity supplied. As they lowered the price, they lowered the amount that they're supplying. So be able to describe what's happening on both sides of a market, regardless of what is being affected in the market. All right, so equilibrium price and quantity of the steak will fall. All right, another effect. Due to a severe drought, the price of corn feed for cattle increases. So here's our market for steak. Is that going to affect the demand or supply for steak? What's going to happen to supply? A decrease? Say the whole sentence. A decrease in supply, because we're talking about a shift of the entire curve, right? All right, so an increase in the price of corn feed is an increase in the price of a production input. So anytime you're thinking about the supply side, always think about, like, if you're the supplier, like, how are my costs being affected? Well, if I'm the guy that's growing a bunch of cattle and all of a sudden I have to pay more for the corn that I feed them, then my costs are going up. That means that at any given price now, I'm going to supply less because it costs me more to produce the good. Yeah. A movement along it, yeah. And the only thing that causes a movement along a curve is a change in the price. So when demand shifted, that changed the equilibrium price, so that caused a movement along the supply curve, which caused a decrease in quantity supplied. So here we're going to have a decrease in supply, right? So the supply curve is going to shift to the left. What happens to equilibrium price? What happens to equilibrium quantity? It goes down, correct. What happens on the demand side? Describe what happens to the demand side in very precise terms. Quantity supplied, quantity demanded will decrease, is how you describe that, right? So supply shifted to the left, right? This was the old equilibrium. So now at the old price, you've got less being supplied than is being demanded. That means people will bid up the price. That means the new equilibrium will be here. So a decrease in supply led to a decrease in quantity demanded. So that's what this is, the movement along the demand curve. You just have to be precise about it. If you're not precise about it, you're not going to be clear about what you're talking about, right? So you have to be able to be clear. All right, one more. The technology for steak production improves at the same time consumer incomes rise. Assume that steak is a normal good. All right, so we're talking about two effects here. The technology for steak production improves. Is that going to affect the demand or supply side? Supply. What's going to happen? Supply will increase, correct. At the same time, consumer incomes rise. Is that going to affect the demand or supply side? Demand side, right? What is that going to do to demand? It's going to increase demand. Exactly. It's going to increase demand. Because we assumed steak is a normal good, right? A normal good we defined last time is a good where incomes go up, you buy more of it. Incomes go down, you buy less of it. Luxury cars, luxury anything, name brand stuff, generally normal goods. Inferior goods, generic brand hot dogs, crappy frozen dinners. Inferior goods are goods that you buy less of as your income goes down and buy more of when your income, got that backwards. As your income goes up, you buy less inferior goods, and as your income goes down, you buy more inferior goods. And again, inferior goods aren't defined specifically. They're very subjective, meaning it depends on the subject, whoever's deciding. So, you can think of a good as inferior. I can think of a good as normal. It doesn't matter as long as we are clear about what we mean by that. All right, so we're assuming steak is a normal good. So therefore, incomes go up. Quantity demanded will go up at any given price. All right, so let's look at what happens graphically. So here's our market for steak. Here's our initial equilibrium. Let's consider each effect in turn, one at a time. So again, the technology for steak improves. You guys said that it would affect the supply side, and you said it would increase the supply. So that will shift the supply to the right. So technology improves, meaning that it's just easier to produce over like an hour. Any given time unit, you can produce more because your technology to produce has improved. And so at any given price, you're willing to supply more because essentially your costs have gone down to produce the amount you're producing. So that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. We know what's going to happen as far as price and equilibrium, right? Equilibrium quantity. We know that equilibrium price will fall and equilibrium quantity will increase. We also know that because of an increase in supply, there's going to be an increase in quantity demanded, right? We're going to move to the right along the demand curve. All right, so that's one effect. But there's another effect. We know incomes have also gone up. Steak is a normal good. People are buying more steak. So at any given price, people are going to demand more steak, so demand will increase. That will shift demand to the right. So seemingly, it seems as though, based on what we see here, that equilibrium quantity will increase as a result of both effects, and that equilibrium price will slightly decrease. It's slightly below. But remember, when two curves shift, one of the variables, either quantity or price, it will be unclear what's going to happen with that variable. And so you have to think whenever you're being asked to consider two different shifts, like what would happen if like I shifted the curves differently than I shifted them? Like nobody told me to shift the supply curve this much. Nobody told me to shift the demand curve this much. I just shifted them in the direction that the problem implied I should shift them. But let's say that instead of shifting the demand curve, that much, we shifted it a little bit more. When you do that, equilibrium quantity still increases. So it is clear that equilibrium quantity will increase as a result of both of these effects. What is not clear is what happens to equilibrium price. We see that shifting it just a little bit will lead to a lower equilibrium price, but shifting a little bit more will lead to a higher equilibrium price. And so therefore, it is unclear what happens to equilibrium price. So you just need to be able to say that. You need to be able to say, if it's unclear for one, and then what is actually happening to the other if there are two effects occurring at the same time. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? So again, this is not exactly how you would see it, but like this is a way of kind of, making you kind of work through a problem and kind of think about what are the effects of a change on this market, and how can you describe, the various impacts of that change. All right. Let's do this multiple choice. We have time. What time do we get together today? 12:30. Okay. All right, we have time. So which of the following will not shift the production possibility frontier out? So remember, the production possibility frontier represents the total amount that can be produced given the state of technology and the productive resources of the two goods that we're considering. But the production possibility frontier can shift out when there's economic growth, right? That's how we represent economic growth in our production possibility frontier model. Economic growth is the increased ability of the economy to produce over time, like I've mentioned, because of technological revolutions. The overall amount that our economies can produce has increased significantly over the last couple hundred years, which has led to the standard of living that we all enjoy today. That, again, if you go back a couple hundred years, is the kind of standard of living that the wealthiest in the world were enjoying, maybe even less than that. So we need to be happy about today being alive in this era, having the things we have available to us, regardless of what class we may be in. Anyway, so production possibility frontier. Which of the following will not shift it out? Which of the following does not represent economic growth, essentially? An improvement of the technology level of the economy, Will that shift the production possibility frontier out? Yes, it will, right? That is one of the things, because we're assuming that technology and our productive inputs are being held constant when we have a production possibility frontier, and it shifts out when either one of those things change. An increase in the workforce of the economy, will that shift the production possibility frontier out? Yes, that is one of our inputs into production, labor. So that is the resources, that is one of the resources we use to produce. If you have more labor to produce, you can produce more of everything. A change in the preference of the consumers of the economy to consume more of one good. Will that shift our production possibility frontier out? No, it will not. Exactly. That has nothing to do with production. It has everything to do with consumption, right? We talked about efficiency and how efficiency for the entire economy reflects efficiency not just in production but in allocation, meaning that on the consumption side, people are satisfied. So if the things that are being produced are the things that people want to buy, then we have allocative efficiency. If we're using everything we need, everything we have to produce, then we have productive efficiency. And if we have both productive and allocative efficiency, then we have efficiency for the economy as a whole. But as far as the economy's ability to produce, the tastes of consumers, the things that people want to consume, has no effect on how much we can actually produce. And so, yes, C is the one that will not shift the production possibility frontier out, which means that an increase in the amount of capital in the economy will. Capital, as I mentioned, is another one of these resources that we use to produce inputs into production. And it represents like the people-made stuff, like machines, factories, etc., the things that we use to produce. That is what capital will embody. And so, indeed, it is going to be C. Why? Again, production possibility frontier illustrates the trade-off facing an economy that produces only two goods. It shows the maximum quantity of one good that can be produced for any given quantity produced of the other, given the existing resources and the existing technology. If either the existing resources or existing technology change, that will shift the production possibility frontier. That will represent economic growth within the production possibility frontier model. And finally, let's do this other one, changes in the market for bicycles. How will the market for bicycles be affected by an increase in the price of gasoline and an increase in the desire for exercise? So you have two effects being considered. An increase in the price of gasoline. Is that going to affect the supply or demand of the market? The demand of the market, right? So in the market for bicycles, a substitute for riding a bicycle is a car, right? And a bicycle is a substitute for driving a car. So if the price of gasoline goes up, people are going to substitute away from driving a car to riding a bicycle, and vice versa. So if there's an increase in the price of gasoline, what's going to happen in the market for bicycles? Increase in demand, right? People will now want to ride bicycles more at any given price, right? All right, let's look at the other effect. An increase in the desire for exercise. Is that going to affect the supply or the demand side? Demand again, right? So we have two effects that are going to affect demand. This one has to do with taste, right? That was one of the things that we talked about that affect demand. If people just overall feel better about exercising than they did maybe 20 years ago, then at any given price, people are going to buy more bicycles. So demand for bicycles will increase as a result of a change in taste. So here we have two things that are affecting the demand side. So we know that there's going to be an increase in demand because of the decrease in the price of gasoline. What's going to happen as a result of an increase in the desire for exercise? Increase in demand as well. So here's my supply, here's my demand. Easy way to kind of just do it for yourself. Demand has shifted to the right. What's going to happen to equilibrium price? It's going to go up. Equilibrium quantity went up as well. So essentially we're looking for what's going to happen to the equilibriums. We know that price and quantity will increase. And in order to solve a problem like this really quickly, just always ask yourself what's changing, supply or demand or both. We know that an increase in the gasoline because of everything I mentioned. This is everything I talked about already. Is going to increase demand. So demand will shift to the right. That will increase equilibrium price, increase equilibrium quantity. The second thing, the desire for exercise, that will also, that has to do with taste, that will also increase demand. And so again, the effect will be the same. So demand shifts to the right, and again, equilibrium price and quantity both increase. So that's the effect of both of those effects on equilibrium price and quantity, both increased. What happens on the supply side of the market? Quantity supplied increase. Yes, exactly. Quantity supplied increase because we just moved up and along the supply curve, and therefore quantity supplied increase. All right. All right. We're done with that stuff. So there's some homework problems too that kind of help you think about these things. So just go through them, like practice, like. Again, the main effects that we consider in this class are listed in the last chapter that affect either supply or demand. So get those down so that you know when you're reading a problem, like, okay, you kind of know what category it'll fall into, and then you'll immediately be able to say, okay, it's affecting this side of the market versus this side, and then just kind of do the analysis. What's happening to price? What's happening to quantity? What's happening on the other side of the market? All right, let's jump into this new stuff here. Consumer and producer surplus. So in the chapter, we're going to learn what consumer surplus is and its relationship to the demand curve. We're also going to learn what producer surplus is and its relationship to the supply curve. We're going to look at what total surplus is and how it can be used to both measure the gains from trade and to illustrate why markets work so well. We'll talk about why property rights and prices as economic signals are critical to smooth functioning of markets. We'll talk about why markets typically lead to efficient outcomes despite the fact that they sometimes fail. So again, we're going to start this chapter today. We'll finish it off on Thursday. All right, so let's focus on consumer surplus first and demand. So consumer surplus reflects a willingness to pay. So everybody has a willingness to pay for an item, right? Like I can go around and ask you, like, how much are you willing to pay for like a large pizza? Some of you will say, $5. Others of you will say like $40, depending on how much you love pizza, how much money you have, etc. So the willingness to buy is a consumer's willingness to pay for a good. It's the maximum price at which he or she would buy that good. So the table here shows 5 potential buyers of a used book that costs $100 new, listed in order of their willingness to pay. Alicia will pay $59, Brad $45, Claudia $35, Darren $25, Edwina $10. So none of their willingness to pay is met by the price. Obviously, none of them will buy at $100. So we've answered this question. How many of these 5 students will actually buy a used book? It will depend on the price ultimately. The price of a used book, let's say, so that's the price for the $100. The $100 is the price for the new book. So then the question is, how much would they pay for the used book? And it depends on the used book price. So if the price of a used book is $55, only Alicia buys one. If it's $55, she has a willingness to pay of $59. Her willingness to pay exceeds the price she would have to pay by $4. So she would buy it. Whereas Brad, his is $45. That's the most he's willing to pay for the book. So that's less than the $55 that the bookstore is charging for the used book. He's not going to buy it. Claudia, same. Darren, same. Edwina, same. But let's say the price was $40. If the price was $40, then of course Alicia will still buy. She's still above it. Brad's willingness to pay is also above it. 45 is above the $40. Brad will also buy the book. So the information on the table can be used to construct a demand schedule for used textbooks given just the demand of these 5 users. So because there's only 5 users, we use this like step demand curve just to represent the fact that at $59, only Alicia will buy the book, and then at $45, Alicia and Brad will buy the book. So 2 at $45, Claudia at $35, she's willing to buy it too, so that's 3 people. So at $35, you have 3 people, and so on and so forth. That's why it looks the way it does. It's just a stepwise defined graph, which again is specific to a market that has a very limited amount of people. So we can use the demand schedule to derive this market demand curve. So because we're considering only a small number of consumers, the curve doesn't look like the smooth demand curve of Chapter 3. For the analysis of consumer surplus, it doesn't matter whether a demand curve is step-shaped or whether there are many consumers making a smooth curve. So it doesn't matter. All right, anyway. All right, let's examine consumer surplus in this market at various price levels. So in a market, you will have an individual consumer surplus. So the individual consumer surplus is the net gain to an individual buyer from the purchase of a good. It's equal to the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the price paid. So suppose the campus bookstore makes used textbooks available at a price of $30. So we'll set our price here at $30. So obviously at $30, that meets Alicia, Brad, and Claudia's willingness to pay, right? But their willingness to pay actually exceeds the price being charged in the market. So Alicia has a consumer surplus of the difference between what she's willing to pay and what she has to pay. So 59 minus 30, which is $29. Brad, willing to pay 45. He only has to pay 30. So 45 minus 30 is 15. So he has a consumer surplus of $15. That's his individual consumer surplus. And then Claudia, again, she's willing to pay 35 for it. It meets her willingness to pay, and her willingness to pay exceeds the price by $5, which is her individual consumer surplus. So $35 minus 30 equals $5 in consumer surplus for Claudia. Gets us to the concept of total consumer surplus. It's the sum of the individual consumer surpluses of all the buyers of a good in a market. So in this case, pretty simple stuff. You just add the individual consumer surpluses of Alicia, Brad, and Claudia. So you've got $29 plus $15, that's $44, plus $5, which is $49. So there's a total consumer surplus in this used bookstore market of $49. Any questions on this? Yeah. So in a market, let's say a firm knows that it can sell a certain amount at $5, and there's a certain amount of consumer surplus at that amount, which means that there's an excess willingness to pay. If the business knows that and they can calculate it, then they can figure out a way to extract that consumer surplus. Some firms will do it. It just depends on the kind of market a firm operates in. So like Home Depot, when they charge that subscription price or that yearly membership price to get in, so that generally will represent a consumer surplus that they know exists for, on average, all of their goods. And so they'll use that quantity to be able to estimate how much that yearly fee should be. The average what? Because everybody in the market is they're all interacting, and they all have individual consumer surpluses. So that consumer surplus that exists for the entire market, it shouldn't be averaged out, because then you're saying that everybody is kind of representative, like everybody kind of has on average the same, which is not the case. So you need to be able to quantify the entire thing in order to get everybody that has a willingness to pay above and below the average. And so when you do that, then you can get a more accurate figure that you can then use for the strategy I mentioned. Other strategies are like bundling. Like you could say, well, if people are willing to buy 3 books, well, what if we bundled 3 books together, sold them together, and then we know there's a consumer surplus of $49, so then we'll add that $49 to the price they're already paying, and then they'll be willing to pay for it, because we know that there's excess willingness to pay for 3 units in this market. So it's a really useful number. It's really simply presented here because that's how you introduce the concept. And ultimately, life is a lot more complicated than what we see in this class. But it is the basis for like these kind of big business strategies that do wind up increasing profits quite a bit. So if you're going to be a business student, you'll learn more about that later. All right. So Generally in economics, we don't talk about individual consumer surplus and total consumer surplus. We just say consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is often used to refer both to individual and total consumer surplus. So the previous figure illustrated the following general principle. The total consumer surplus generated by purchases of a good at a given price is equal to the area below the demand curve but above the price. The same principle applies regardless of the number of consumers. So let's say we have just a normal market. In this case, we're just going to talk about widgets, which is just like some generic just device. So price of widgets, quantity of widgets, and there's a smooth downward sloping demand curve. So if the price is $20 in the market, then the area below the demand curve and above that price will be the consumer surplus in the market. And so to quantify that, to put a number on it, we need to get the area of this figure we're looking at, the area of a triangle. So you just kind of need to remember the formula for the area of a triangle, 1/2 the base times the height. So as in the original example, consumer surplus is equal to the area below the demand curve but above the price. It's computed by getting the area of the shape of the triangle. So the area of a triangle, again, is 1/2 the base times the height. So what is the base of this triangle? It's 90, right? So the base is always going to be the quantity demanded at the price we're considering. What's going to be the height of the triangle? It's 60, right? The difference between 80, which is the y-intercept for the demand curve, and 20, the price that we're considering. So you got 1/2 the base, which is 90, times the height, which is 80 minus 20. So then that winds up being 540 divided by 2, which is a 270. Or I'm sorry, 5,400 divided by 2, which is 2,700. So there's $2,700 worth of consumer surplus in this market based on the analysis we just did. Any questions on that? So there's an excess willingness to pay of $2,700 above and beyond what people are already paying in the market. So it's up to a firm to figure out how to best extract that from consumers. And they do figure it out, believe me. Gesundheit. All right, so let's talk about how changing prices affect consumer surplus. So it's often important to know how much consumer surplus changes when prices change. So the same approach we have used to derive consumer surplus can be used to answer questions about how changes in prices affect consumers. So let's say we were originally at a price of $30 and we had consumer surplus here, here, and here. This is what we calculated earlier. And let's say that something happened in the market and the equilibrium price dropped. So it would likely be an increase in supply that'll lower the equilibrium price. Something's changing the price and it's lowering it. So we're getting to a new price of $20 now. So at $20, obviously, we're going to get more consumer surplus for the existing folks, and also we're going to get some consumer surplus for Darren, who is now willing to buy, who was not willing to buy before because his willingness to pay wasn't being met by the price, right? The price was above his willingness to pay, which is $25. So the original buyers get an increase in consumer surplus, and the new buyers add more consumer surplus. So again, Alicia, Brad, and Claudia increase their existing consumer surplus that we calculated earlier, and now Darren has some consumer surplus as well. So the total increase in consumer surplus is the sum of the shaded areas. Alicia, it's going to be now she's going to get an extra $10, right? And Brad, same thing, and Claudia, same thing, and then Darren is going to be $5, right? 25 is what he's willing to pay, 20 is what he has to pay. So Darren will have a consumer surplus of $5. And so adding it together, we see a total increase in consumer surplus, which we describe in economics as welfare. So we use the term welfare to describe how good a market is doing in terms of consumer and producer surplus, which we'll talk about in a second. So there's been an increase in welfare in this market in the amount of $35 as a result of the price going down. The price went down, that increased welfare, in the market. It increased the consumer surplus in the market. Any questions? All right, so the figure shows the same result for the case of a smooth demand curve, the demand for, let's say, iPads. Let's say this is, I don't know, 2003 or something, and iPads are just being invented, and people are just starting to use them, so they're willing to pay a lot for them. At $5,000, people will buy 200,000. At $1,500, people will buy 1 million. So as in the used textbook example, the gain in consumer surplus comes from two sources. It comes from the increased consumer surplus of the existing buyers. So at $5,000, so this is the price. So all these consumers have an excess willingness to pay, and therefore this triangle is the consumer surplus at $5. But when the price drops to $15, the consumer surplus becomes this entire triangle, right? And so then you've got these people here who already had consumer surplus who now have an increase in consumer surplus. So in this case, the dark blue rectangle is the gain to the 200,000 people who would have bought iPads even at a price of, well, I should say 5,000. I'm sorry. I had changed this earlier and I didn't change all of it yet, but it's fine. I'll fix it later. Anyway, so there's an increase in consumer surplus here. So those 200,000 people now have an excess willingness to pay of $3,500 each times the 200,000. So that's an increase in consumer surplus. So again, the point is to highlight the fact that when there's a price drop, there are people that already had a consumer surplus will increase their consumer surplus, but there will also be an increase in consumer surplus from the new buyers that now enter the market that were not willing to buy it before at the higher price. So at a price of $5,000, none of these folks are willing to buy it. Their willingness to pay was not being met. But now at a price of $1,500, we see that all these folks are willing to buy iPads. So the darker blue triangle is the gain to people who would not have bought the good at the high price but are willing to do so now at a price of $1,500. So that's the consumer surplus gained by the new buyers. As before, the total gain in consumer surplus is the sum of the shaded areas, the increase in the area under the demand curve but above the price. So just be able to identify changes in surpluses as a result of changing conditions in the market. And just basically understand consumer surplus, be able to calculate it, and then be able to identify changes. So if the price of a good were to rise, though, you would have the opposite effect, and it would be in reverse, right? So if we were initially at $1,500, consumer surplus would decrease if the price went up to $5,000. You would have a loss in consumer surplus from the people that drop out of the market, and then you'd have a loss in consumer surplus from those that remain in the market and now are still willing to pay the price, have some consumer surplus, but because of the new price, they lose some of their old surplus. All right, let's turn to the other side of the market, the producer surplus and its relationship to the supply curve. So just as buyers of a good would have been willing to pay more for their purchase than the price they actually pay, some sellers of a good would have been willing to sell it for less than the price they actually receive. So let's talk about the relationship between cost and producer surplus. So a seller's cost is the lowest price at which he or she is willing to sell a good. And that gets us to their individual producer surplus. It is the net gain to an individual seller from selling a good. It is equal to the difference between the price received and the seller's individual cost. So the table shows the prices at which different students would be willing to sell their used book. So Andrew is willing to sell it for $5, Betty for $15, Carlos $25, Donna $35, Engelbert $45. Now they don't have costs in terms of producing the book because they're just selling a used book. But remember, when we're talking about costs in this class, we're talking about both explicit and implicit costs, which add up to be opportunity costs. The explicit costs of producing something is what you use to produce it, right? You pay for your factory, you pay for your materials, you pay for your workers. So those are the explicit costs. The implicit costs are the costs of things that you give up in order to do what you're doing, the cost of the next best use of your resources. So if you're spending $5 to produce a book, let's say, then you're not using that money to buy like something in the stock market that could give you a return of like 5% or something a year. So that 5% a year is your implicit cost. And so therefore your opportunity cost is the sum of your explicit plus implicit cost. It's the sum of the materials you used to produce plus what you gave up to produce, which is the interest you could have earned if you just invested your money in the stock market. So here, when we're talking about the cost to these potential sellers of a used book, obviously there's no explicit cost of producing a book because they're not producing the book. So there's some implicit cost. And the price reflects the seller's opportunity cost of not having the book in the future. So Andrew thinks that it'll cost him $5 maybe in search costs to find the information he could have just found in his book in the future if he ever were to need the book. So he has a low likelihood of needing the book in the future. Engelbert, he probably will need the book in the future, and so his opportunity cost of selling the book now is higher, so it's $45, and then everybody else is kind of in between. So just as we derive the demand curve from the willingness to pay of different consumers, we can derive the supply curve from the cost of different producers. So Andrew has a cost of $5, Betty $15, Carlos $25, Donna $35, Engelbert $45. Each of them will have individual producer surpluses. So whatever the price will be, the difference between their price and the cost of supplying the good is going to be their individual producer surplus. If we add those together, we'll get the sum of the individual producer surpluses of all the sellers of a good in a market, which is called the total producer surplus. So as in the case of consumer surplus, we can find the individual producer surpluses of sellers to calculate the total producer surplus. So once we do that, we can just call it producer surplus. So producer surplus, again, is what we'll use from this point forward to just talk about both individual and total producer surplus. We just call it producer surplus. Just like with consumer surplus, you talk about individual consumer surplus, you talk about total consumer surplus, or you can just refer to all of it as just consumer surplus. All right, so let's assume that the campus bookstore is willing to buy all the used copies of this book that students are willing to sell at a price of $30, right? So at a price of $30, we see that Andrew's cost is being met, Betty's is being met, and Carlos is being met. So the three of them will sell their book. Donna's is not being met, and Engelbert's is not being met either, so they will not sell their book. So the total increase in producer surplus is the sum of the shaded areas. In this case, we've got Andrew. He's willing to sell at $5, but he gets to sell at $30. So the difference between $30 and $5 is $25. So that's his individual producer surplus, or just his producer surplus, $25. Betty, she's willing to sell for $15, but she gets to sell for $30. So she's got an individual producer surplus of $15. And Carlos is willing to sell for $25, but he gets to sell for $30. So he gets that individual producer surplus of $5 as well. So therefore, total producer surplus, or just producer surplus for this market of used books at a price of $30 is equal to the sum of these three sellers' individual producer surpluses, which is equal to $45. So we have a general rule for determining the total producer surplus from sales of a good. The total producer surplus from sales of a good at a given price is the area above the supply curve but below the price. This rule applies both to examples like the one we see here, where there's a small number of producers and there's like a step-shaped supply curve, and to the more realistic examples where there are many suppliers and the supply curve is smooth, as we've already seen in the last chapter, which we'll look at right now, actually. So consider, for example, the supply of wheat. So here we have the price of wheat, quantity of wheat, and here's our upward sloping supply curve reflecting the law of supply. As the price goes up, suppliers will supply more. So quantity supplied increases as price increases. So the figure shows how producer surplus depends on the price per bushel. So if the price per bushel is $5, then all of these sellers down here who have costs below the price the market has set have individual producer surpluses adding them all together, aggregating them, as we say in economics, combining them into the whole from the individual parts, aggregating. We get a total producer surplus to be the area above the supply curve and below the price in the market. So the area of this triangle represents the producer surplus in this market. So the benefit to the farmers from selling their wheat at a price of $5 is their producer surplus, which is equal to the shaded area in the figure. So again, that is the benefit to sellers selling in a market, as consumer surplus is the benefit to buyers buying in a market. You have a bunch of people that are willing to pay more, but because a market is set up where there's a bunch of buyers and a bunch of sellers, because society has organized this way of us buying and selling to each other, then those that have a higher willingness to pay than the price get to benefit from the market, and that is represented as their consumer surplus. And on the supplier side, you have sellers that have costs lower than price, and they get to charge a higher price, whereas if there wasn't a market and they just were selling their individual goods by themselves in a world where there aren't a bunch of sellers selling the same thing, then they would probably just charge the price that that would meet their costs, and therefore they wouldn't have producer surplus. So producer surplus is the benefit. It's the welfare resulting from the fact that we have these markets where these sellers and buyers can interact. Let's look at how changing prices affect producer surplus. As with the case of consumer surplus, a change in price alters producer surplus, but the effects are opposite. So initially we have a price of $5. Our consumer surplus is again the area below the price and above the supply curve. While a fall in price increases consumer surplus, as we saw earlier, it reduces producer surplus. So, and then the opposite is the case. A rise in price reduces consumer surplus, but increases producer surplus. So consider a rise in the price of the good. So in this case, the price of wheat has gone up to $7. And so because of that, quantity supplied has increased, right? We've moved up along the supply curve. And now you have all these other sellers that weren't willing to sell before, now willing to sell. So you've got these sellers that were selling before had a producer surplus. They now have more producer surplus. And then now there's an increase in producer surplus from the new sellers that are willing to sell as a result of the higher price. So again, some producers would have produced the good at the original price. They will gain the entire price increase on every unit they purchase. So again, this is the increase in producer surplus for those sellers that were already selling in the market, whose costs were already being met. And others will enter the market because of the higher price. They will gain only the difference between the new price and their costs. So then this triangle here represents the producer surplus gained by the new sellers. So you need to be able to kind of do this analysis. All right, this is a homework question. Chapter 4, homework question 5, market for burgers. The figure, the market for burgers shows the weekly market for hamburgers in Irvine, Kentucky, let's say. Again, here's our price, there's our quantity for burgers. Quantity is in thousands per day. Here's our downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Equilibrium price is $1.50, equilibrium quantity is 400. If the price of burgers falls from $1.50 to $1, there is a loss in producer surplus. How much of the loss accrues because of the change in the quantity supplied? All right, so remember, this is going to be, this is the opposite case of what we just looked at. Here, the price is going to fall. When the price falls, there's going to be a bunch of sellers that are going to drop out of the market, and that's what the question is asking. How much of the drop in producer surplus is theirs versus the people that will remain in the market whose producer surplus will simply be diminished? So that's the entire producer surplus at the old price. Let's say demand shifts to the left is what's causing the price to fall. So therefore, quantity supplied is decreasing as a result of demand decreasing, getting us to a new equilibrium of $1, let's say. So that means all these sellers over here now drop out of the market. So This is the producer surplus of those producers still in the market. And this represents the producer surplus of the sellers that were in the market that are no longer in the market. So that's what it's asking us. How much of the loss accrues because of the change in quantity supplied? It wants us to know, it wants us to tell it how much is this producer surplus. So again, you're going to need the equation for a triangle, 1/2 the base times the height, right? In this case, the base is what? It's 200, right? 200, this is 400, so 400 minus 200 is 200. The height is, it's 0.5, right? It's the top or the bottom, however you want to look at it. It's this length here, so 150 minus $1, right? So area of the triangle is 1/2 the base times the height. 1/2 the base is 200. The height is equal to 0.5, and so that's going to get us to $50. So again, if the price of the burger falls from $1.50 to $1, there's a loss of producer surplus by 50 cents, by $50 in this case, from those sellers that are no longer in the market, from because of the change in quantity supplied. So it's not just supply and demand. There's like a lot of information in there, and you can analyze these markets very precisely and get some very precise information from it, which is why we require you to be able to do it and understand it and be able to quantify these things like we have in class. So make sure that you understand everything we did today, and we will continue on with this chapter and jump into the next chapter on Thursday. Have a good couple of days. Work hard. I'll see you.